One of my coworkers approached me and asked me if I could look at their Cadet trimmer, and of course I didn't have a problem with it. What they didn't tell me was that it was going to be one of their 4-cycle units, which I don't find all that fun to work on. And on top of all that, once I got my hands on it, I realized that someone had already worked on it, and man did they do a number on it. Sometimes I really need to know when to say no, because this one would have been a good one to start on. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Cadet 4-cycle trimmer, and the problem is that it won't start. Well, sort of. The real reason why is because the pull rope and the recoil assembly is damaged beyond repair. However, the rest of the fuel system isn't going to matter much until this part is fixed or replaced. Now, I'm going to try and repair this string trimmer, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now, before we get too far into the project, I'm going to document all the stickers that I can find. That way, when we need to order the new parts for this project, we'll have all the information we need to make sure we get the right ones. So next, we need to check out the oil level in the engine, and then once we know there's plenty of oil in there, we'll then try and see if it'll start up. Now surprisingly, there's plenty of oil in it, but I have to wonder if someone's filled it up recently because it looks brand new. Next, we'll need to take off what has to be the most stubborn air filter cover ever made. This air filter is covered in oil, which is apparently coming from the emissions port, which is not a good sign. So either there's too much oil in the engine, or the trimmer has been used on its side, which is not recommended. And finally, we can see someone's handiwork to the recoil, and I couldn't even guess as to why they did this since there was already access to the starter. And as you just heard, it started fairly easily considering we're using a drill, but by the end of the video, we'll see how it starts with a functioning recoil. Also, before we start to take apart this machine, I would like to give it a quick spray and rinse. But if your machine is already clean, you can skip this part. However, that doesn't happen all that often. I would also recommend that you give it plenty of time for the water to evaporate, or you can use some compressed air to help out. Now, while I was cleaning this machine, that's when I noticed that some of the fasteners were either loose or just missing, which is not a good sign. Of course, it is your machine, but having a couple of missing fasteners does make it a bit less safe to use. Next, we need to replace the fuel lines, and to make it easier to film, I'm going to take off the airbox and the carb, which is something we have to do anyway since we need to inspect the carb for a possible servicing. Now, once we get a good look into the fuel tank, we begin to get a good picture as to how this machine was taken care of. So as you can see, that's supposed to be the fuel filter line, but there's no filter on it, meaning there could be a lot of debris inside the carb now. So the filter could have recently fallen off the fuel line, but we should be able to tell more about it once we look inside the carb. Unfortunately, with the carb out of the way, we find out that one of the openings in the fuel tank is a lot bigger than it should be. Now, this may not seem like a big deal to you, but later on, you're going to find out why it is. So at first, I thought I was going to use these two sizes of fuel lines, not realizing that the larger one had been modified. But once I did realize it, I had to upsize the regular fuel line to the next size up, and that's when things go terribly wrong. Now, the first line we'll be installing is my regular 3/16 of an inch fuel line, and it's going to be my return line. Also, I'm not going to be installing the plastic splice on the return line, and instead, I'm just going to make sure there's more than an inch of line inside the fuel tank. This will help to ensure that the fuel return line won't accidentally come out of the fuel tank. Next, we'll install the much larger fuel line into the modified opening. But this time, we'll need to pull the fuel line out so we can install the fuel filter on it. Once the fuel filter has been installed, make sure that it's located near the bottom of the tank, otherwise the system will starve of fuel once it gets too low. So next we can finally start to take the carb apart, and the most important part we want to check is the metering diaphragm, but this is when I make a terrible mistake. Now, the job of the metering diaphragm is to help regulate fuel flow through the carb, and to do that it needs to be flexible. The problem is that it's not that flexible, and in fact it's quite stiff, which means it's not going to work. So here's the tough part. You can either order a brand new metering diaphragm, buy a brand new carb, or you can try and save the old diaphragm. If the old diaphragm is not too far gone, you can try and soak it overnight and see if it makes it more flexible. The longer you soak it, the better the results, and for me, anything over 2 days is the best. Now this one, I would rate a 4 out of 5 in stiffness, so it's going to take a couple days to get flexible again. While we're here, I'm also going to replace that cracked purge bulb. Now these are not that expensive to buy. But if you have to buy 2 new parts, then I would just consider spending that money on a new carb instead. I'm not going to wait on the metering diaphragm to soften up, and that's because I already stocked these in my toolbox. But I will keep the old one in the solution and use it on a day when I run out. So what was the mistake that I made? Well, for some reason, I didn't bother inspecting the pumping diaphragm, and this is going to come back and haunt me. Next, I'm going to temporarily install the carb to the engine. That way I can see where to cut the fuel lines at. You don't have to do it this way, but it does help out a lot. Now, the fuel lines are not that expensive, but if you're not careful, you could end up cutting your line way too short and you'll need to run another line. So here's why modifying the opening in the fuel tank was a bad idea. The extra large fuel line won't fit tightly on the port on the carb. Now, I do have two ways to get around this problem, and for this one, I'm going to have to use some wire and make a ring to add pressure to the line. Next, we'll correctly install the carb and the airbox to the engine, making sure to connect the emissions breather hose as well. The last thing to do before we try and start the engine is to of course add 100% gasoline with no ethanol to the fuel tank. Then we'll need to confirm that fuel is flowing through the lines like they should be. When pressing on the bulb, fuel should come up the large fuel line and into the carb, fill the bulb, and then leave the carb through the return line and back to the tank. So the fuel is having a really tough time coming up the fuel line, and this is when I realized I had made my mistake about not checking the pumping diaphragm on the carb. So I saved you the hassle of having to watch me take the carb off the engine again, and next we'll have to separate the carb, but it seems to be kind of stuck. Don't worry, it's nothing that a bit of persuasion can't fix, just be careful and try not to damage it. So it turns out there was a lot of corrosion on this brass part, and that's why it was so difficult to take it apart. We'll spray some carb cleaner on the corrosion to get rid of it, but the biggest problem is with the diaphragm itself. So first off, the diaphragm is supposed to be flexible, but it's not, and secondly, one of the check valve flaps is bent out of position. Both of these would make a carb unusable, but there's still a chance to try and fix it. What we're going to do is carefully take off the pumping diaphragm and put it into our solution to try and make it soft again. Now, if you damage it too much while taking it off, there's no saving it, and your next best choice is to just replace the carb. The reason I overlooked the pumping diaphragm is because 9 times out of 10 it's made out of a different material than this one. But when the pumping diaphragm is made from this material, they have a greater tendency to become less flexible over time. Also, here's a shot of the ring that I had to make to get the fuel line to seal around the port on the carb. So it's been a couple of days and the diaphragm looks a whole lot better than the last time we saw it. And as you can see, it's a whole lot more flexible than it was before, and it would also seem that the check valve flap is also back into position. However, to truly find out if it is, I'd recommend placing it back on the carb and seeing how the flap seals against it. It seems to be sitting flat against the openings in the carb, so I ended up putting the carb back together again. Hopefully this works, otherwise we'll have to order a brand new carb instead. Here's the part about owning a 4-cycle trimmer that makes me not want one, and that's all the extra maintenance. Since I have no idea when the valve clearances were last checked, I'm going to check them now. After rotating the engine until one of the rocker arms is all the way down while the other one is up, we'll see how a 5/1000 feeler fits in the clearance. And it turns out to be just a bit loose, but not by much, and after a bit of trial and error, we find out that the clearance is 7/1000 of an inch, which is not too bad. We'll then rotate the engine again, and that way we can check the other arm's clearance. Now, since we know that the first arm's clearance was 7/1000, we'll see if this one was about the same, which it wasn't. And after a bit more trial and error, it turns out the clearance on this one was 8/1000, which is not too bad either. However, I like to set my clearances to 5/1000 of an inch, but you're welcome to use whatever value you think it should be. Now to set it, all we need to do is put the feeler in the clearance and then turn the adjusting nut clockwise until the feeler almost gets stuck. You'll then need to rotate the engine again and do the same method to that one, and then you can close up the engine. On this engine, there are no jam nuts to worry about, and that's because these adjusting nuts are very difficult to turn, that way they won't back out on their own. The last thing I want to do before we try and start the engine is a compression test. The test will see how much pressure the engine can make, and the higher the reading, the better the health. A good reading would be something well over 100 psi, but if it's below 100, it could mean the engine is worn out and not worth saving. Now because the spark plug is a bit smaller than typical, we'll need to use an adapter to get the tester to fit. And since the pull rope is missing, we'll be using the drill to spin the engine over. And unfortunately, the reading is quite low at only 60 psi, which is not ideal. So does this mean this engine is not worth fixing? Well, to some, it wasn't worth fixing even if it was working. But just because it's low doesn't mean you can't still use it, and to prove it, we're going to see how it starts and runs. Now I did let it warm up some, but it didn't seem to help all that much. We'll try that again, but with the idle speed increased. So it was running pretty well, but it did stop on its own, which means we might have to make a quick adjustment to the carb. Now for this carb, we'll need to use the single D tool, but it also needs to be the ultra small version to work. We'll just turn the hidden screw in the middle of the barrel about a half turn counterclockwise to increase the fuel, and then we'll see what happens. So this time it stayed running and it sounded pretty good too. And while we had to do all that waiting for the solution to work, the package arrived from the seller with the Recoil. Now, I'm not going to replace all the missing fasteners, and that is by choice. The main reason is that I'm not going to run up their bill with fasteners, especially since they didn't care to keep the ones I already had. That, and I can make do with what fasteners I have left, so I'm okay with it. Now once we have the new Recoil secured, we definitely need to try and start the trimmer with it, otherwise they'll need the drill attachment to start it. So it seems to be starting and running very well, even considering the low compression reading, but sometimes that reading doesn't tell the whole story. If it did, and I had done the compression test early on, we would have called off the repair, and this would have either gone into the trash or be left on the wall in the shed for a really long time. Now, there were a lot of mistakes made on this trimmer, but luckily with most of them, we were able to get around them. So my question is, with such a low compression reading, would you have stopped the repair early or kept going? If you had decided to stop, I would not have blamed you.
Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.